To see you again in this final week of Parliament. I think today is going to be a historic day in the House. With me at the press conference this morning, I have members that served on the Constitutional Review Committee, starting at my far right, Dr. Annelie Lotriet, Thandeka Mbabama, the DA spokesperson on land, and our 1SA spokesperson on land, Glynis Breitenbach, and Vusi Magwebu, who represented us from the NCOP on the Constitutional Review Committee. Today, Parliament is set to debate and vote on the flawed Constitutional Review Committee report. The report makes a recommendation that Section 25, the property clause of the Constitution, be amended to allow for expropriation without compensation. The Democratic Alliance is completely committed to redressing the history of violent land dispossession in South Africa and recognizing the legacy, unjust legacy, left by this dispossession. We view land reform as a social justice imperative for South Africa and one around which every South African should rally.
This is why the DA will be joined this afternoon by representatives from the Gwatyu Community Association, who have been fighting for the return of their land in the Eastern Cape. The Gwatyu community consists of 1,500 members who remain tenants of the land they live on, at the mercy of the failing ANC government. Their fight is for the security of tenure of the land that they live on, so that they can work their own land and be free from government control. The DA has provided legal assistance to the community, and we will continue to demand that the land is returned to the people of Gwatyu. Expropriation without compensation will not provide land to the Gwatyu community. Only providing ownership and title will. The Gwatyu community is not the only that will remain landless and not realize their economic potential if the efforts of the ANC and the EFF are acceded to in the House today. For too long, black South Africans who have been dispossessed of land that was historically and violently taken away have been tenants in the land of their birth. What the EFF and the ANC are proposing is to continue that cycle of dispossession. The DA commits itself to taking this fight to the highest court of the land if Parliament does not send this report back to the Constitutional Review Committee. The Democratic Alliance will today once again reaffirm this commitment to land reform by voting against the adoption of the flawed Constitutional Review report. We have warned the committee throughout the process that to change the Bill of Rights for the first time in our history requires due processes to be followed. The DA has consulted with our lawyers, and we understand the processes to follow. Should the ANC and the EFF vote to adopt this flawed report in both the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces, the DA will not hesitate to approach the courts. Every forum failed in their court bid because they failed to allow Parliament to complete its processes. It is key that Parliament is given the scope to do its work. We therefore implore on all parties to do the right thing and reject this report.
The committee report has serious procedural flaws, specifically in relation to the public participation process, which is mandated by sections 59, 72 and 118 of the Constitution. The ANC and the EFF were dogged in their determination to ignore the over 80% of written submissions which opposed the amendment of section 25 during the public participation process. The written submissions report has not been finalised. Yet the ANC and the EFF approved the final report. This is proof that the process was merely a smokescreen for what was ultimately a predetermined outcome. The consequences of proceeding with this tarnished process will effectively silence thousands of people who participated in the process. Silencing the thousands of people who came out to voice their opinions on expropriation without compensation, which will lead to nationalisation of land instead of ownership of land, is against the principles of the Constitution. It is no surprise, though, because both the EFF and the ANC have shown disdain and disregard for the Constitution on numerous occasions. However, the rest of the parties represented in Parliament have an opportunity to do what is right today.
The consequences of land expropriation without compensation is real and could have devastating implications on a country already ravaged by unprecedented unemployment, a collapsing economy, sky-high food prices and poverty. Land reform should never be used as a tool to score cheap political points or to use the scars of the past to further divide our nation. It is now more important than ever to acknowledge that the Constitution is not the barrier to land reform, but rather corruption, constrained budgets, and a lack of political will by the failing ANC. The debate on expropriation allows the ANC a get-out-of-jail-free card. It gives them the perfect cover to avoid having to explain their rank failure over 2 decades to take land reform seriously. Systematic issues in the land reform programme have proved to be the major stumbling block in the land reform process that has led to the over 90% failure of such projects.
The ANC and their policy directorate, the EFF, are forging ahead with their plans to further expand their coalition of corruption by equipping the state with enormous power to deprive citizens of ownership. The ANC has proven over the past 24 years that they are not equipped or willing to effect real land reform, rather using their power to enrich themselves and further exploit communities that have been waiting for the return of their land. South Africa requires a land policy which will ensure that black beneficiaries of land reform are empowered and supported through adequate funding of such programs, a ruthless rooting out of corruption, and the political will to implement properly. Where the DA government governs, we have prioritized urban land reform by created homeowners out of nearly 100,000 beneficiaries, facilitate partnerships, and provide adequate support and funding for emerging farmers. Surely this is true economic freedom, and none of this would have been achieved through expropriating without compensation.
Let us be clear. South Africa doesn't have a constitutional problem, it has an ANC problem. By arguing for expropriation without compensation, the ANC and the EFF have been gifted the perfect scapegoat to explain away 2 decades of policy failure. Even if the ANC and the EFF are determined to continue down this misguided path, the Constitution will in all likelihood only be amended in the 6th Parliament after the 2019 election. As such, ordinary South Africans from across the country have an opportunity to send a clear message at the ballot box next year, to stop the ANC from capturing a 2/3 majority and to vote for a party that can actually deliver meaningful land reform. The Democratic Alliance believes that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, and we will continue to fight for the protection and expansion of individual property rights for all. Thank you. We're open to any questions. If you just identify your media house and direct your questions directed to.
I'm still waiting for the press. I just want to make clarity. So, if the 2 houses do adopt the report this week, you're definitely going to court, and will your argument be the same as the one that AfriForum made? So the only issue AfriForum was that they didn't allow Parliament to finish the process. Is that correct?
Sure. Do you want to do it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, if the report is adopted in both houses, yes, we will most certainly go to court. We believe that the process is procedurally fatally flawed and unconstitutional. Our points are not exactly the same as AfriForum's. We have a different legal approach, and their application was premature, and so obviously the legal basis thereof must differ quite substantially.
Let me be clear as well that at every single step of the process, we've given Parliament and its committees an opportunity to rectify the problems. We've pointed out the procedural errors. These are not something we've kept hidden and under a bushel. We've made them very plain to the committee and the chairpersons. At the programming committee, at the Chief Whip's forum, at every step of the way, we've pointed out what the flaws are in the process that this Parliament has used to bring this report before us. And so we have exhausted, at the end of this process, every single internal remedy that was available to us. Therefore, we believe that we will confidently be able to approach the courts with what we believe is a process that is eminently reviewable. Marianne.
Marianne Merchant, Daily Maverick, to the One South Africa land spokesperson. Given your claim that where the DA governs, it does title deeds, etc., and all of that, would you be please commenting on the evictions of poor and working class Cape Townians from inner city suburbs to make way for the developers that the DA City Council has such a lovely relationship with. The lack of providing affordable, secure, and low-cost housing within a reasonable distance to work opportunities. The fact that the transit camps at Blikkiesdorp have existed for over 10 years under a DA administration, and those people still have no homes or title deeds. And perhaps you would also like to comment on the claim with regards to best governance, why the DA is moving to evict economically viable, economically productive farmers in a peri-urban area like the Philippi Aquifer in order to make way for some housing developments one of your favorite big developers is wanting to put up.
Thank you very much. As you will understand, it is not an easy process that we have to go through. And it's not something that can happen overnight. And it is a work in progress. We are working quite hard in the city to make sure that we deliver on the housing and all other requirements that people need. But as I say, it's not an easy process. It cannot happen overnight.
Let me just say there as well that, I mean, a lot of those questions should be directed at the city. They're not really under Tandeka or even my purview. But let me just say this. The DA is committed to overcoming spatial inequality wherever that may exist, wherever we may govern. And I think that if one looks at the progress that the DA has made in the cities where we govern, particularly in handing over title deeds, particularly at focusing on bringing people in through mixed-use developments closer to work environments, I think that our track record is far better than any other government. Are we perfect? Are we there yet? Absolutely not. Have we made more progress, significantly more progress, than any other administrations in the country? I would say absolutely. Cape Town was recently announced, despite the continued attacks on the DA administration there, as the least unequal metropolitan area in the country. And that's not to say that we don't still grapple on a daily basis with apartheid-era spatial planning that relegated poorer communities to the periphery. And we have to, if we're to overcome that, bring working-class poor people close to the city. We're also constrained in a number of these instances, particularly around the evictions, that these are not city evictions. They're evictions that have been obtained through legal process by developers on private land. It's very difficult for cities to intervene in private civil matters between tenants and landlords. But there is a challenge, and we have a problem. And we've all got to work together to overcome the spatial inequality and to start to make our cities far more vibrant places where people live, work, and play closer to opportunities. What we have done to try and bridge this divide is to start rolling out free My City bus services to individuals who want to access the city centre on off-peak times. We're looking at doing so in places like Johannesburg and Tshwane as well. And this is a challenge that faces all of us. It's a challenge that faces every single metropolitan area around the country. It's a challenge, I think, that we're meeting better than any other city administration in the country. Thanks. Jan?
Jan Gerber, News 24. As Afriforum's application, I know Spreitenbach and Patrick were part of the hearings Thursday, I think. Has that in any way complicated your own application? Having been that there is already a judgment, would that complicate your application in any way?
Thanks, Jan. No, it in fact won't. It certainly makes things a little more difficult in that some of the issues that must be raised again have now been thrashed out in a certain fashion. It won't affect the terminology in which our application will be couched. It is significantly different from our approach. And the fact is that the court substantially found that the application was premature and that they had tried to interdict the incorrect party. So obviously that is something that we will do differently, and we will wait for the parliamentary process to run its course. So there'll be no danger of our application being premature, and we're confident that our application will be couched in terms that deals with the procedural flaws and nothing else.
And to see where?
Two short questions. Is there a threshold that you need to be in the House for the report to be adopted by the National Assembly? Is it 50 plus 1 or is it 2/3? I'm not sure. But secondly, on process, do you think it would have made any difference had the committee followed process to your satisfaction? It's not like we're going to support this proposal in any case. Or do you think it would have made any difference if they considered all the written submissions?
My understanding is that this is a committee report. It requires a simple majority in the House. It's not the constitutional amendment process. That has to follow a complete process. All this is recommending is that Parliament initiates an amendment process. That process, if it comes to the House eventually, will require a 2/3 majority to pass the actual constitutional amendment. This is merely a committee report. 201 should be sufficient to pass it. In fact, I think the threshold's even less. I think a committee report, you only need 130 in the House to pass because it's not a piece of legislation. 201 is usually a piece of legislation. Most committee reports are a third of the House. So, what this will do is be the triggering process towards a constitutional amendment process. And as I said earlier in the comments, I think it's highly unlikely, given the tight time frames that we have between now and the House rising probably second week in March, for that to be piloted through the House. So this will probably be something that the 6th Parliament will grapple with, which is why we're making the point that if you want to support property rights, if you want to stop expropriation without compensation, the shortest distance between 2 points is by depriving the ANC and the EFF of 2/3 majority in the next election. And I think that's what the message we were taking out to voters around the country in this election.
John,
Yes.
I'll answer the second part of the
Sure.
question. Yes, you raise a very important point. And I think what we tend to not focus on is the fact that this whole process is not only about the amendment of the Constitution, but an amendment of the Bill of Rights. And therefore, you cannot be lax in the process that you follow. So just by not focusing and not engaging with all the written submissions can make a major difference. So I don't think we should ever leave that out of the equation, and that what we're doing here is, for the first time, an amendment of the Bill of Rights, which is one of those things that you cannot just do with a poor process. So it could, I believe, most definitely have had much more impact if the process was done thoroughly.
Any other questions? Then I'll leave it to our colleagues to do the vernaculars if you need them. And thank you very much for your time this morning. It's greatly appreciated. We'll see you in the House later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who needs vernacular? Anyone need vernacular? Not you, Anders. You was Prince in English. So Anders, you can say you're at a press conference about South Africa's most famous matricular.
Oh, no.
Don't throw me in, please.
Get over it. Move on.